Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Fifth Avenue Synagogue Sunday night speaker series. We truly try our best to offer a wide array of topics from speakers of different backgrounds and different expertise. And tonight we have the opportunity to hear from Mark Emanuel, a co-owner of David Webb Fine Jewelry. This evening's program was arranged by our dear member, Louis Perlman, who is going to formally introduce or somehow interject in the middle of the presentation about a little bit about Mark. But to that point, I'll give it over to President Jacob Gold, who will moderate this evening's discussion.
So I'm sure Louis will be here soon. I saw him today. So I want to thank Louis Perlman for making the introduction to Mark. And also Louis is our neighbor during this construction period of time. And it's not easy for him and his wife. And I want to thank them for all their cooperation with the synagogue during this transitional period. So, and most importantly, I want to thank Mark for giving us his precious time this evening. And as soon as Louis comes on, we'll include him in the discussion. But Mark, if you don't mind, we started before the program. If you could talk a little bit about your family background. We're a synagogue, and learning more about Jewish history is always a good thing. So if you could help us with that, I'd appreciate it.
Thank you. I'm almost grateful that Louis didn't make the introduction, because he's quite famous for his sardonic barbs, and I wouldn't have to figure out how to retort them in a clever way. He's a lovely man, and I'm grateful for his introduction to the Fifth Avenue Synagogue Forum, and I'm thankful to be able to talk with you and your members. I was born to a family. Born into a family of artists. My father was a sculptor. His father was a Hebrew school teacher, an itinerant Hebrew school teacher who started out in Scranton, Pennsylvania in the early part of the 20th century. And they traveled from one location to the other. They were even went as far up as Toronto. They ultimately settled in Rochester, and my father grew up early on in Scranton, and would tell stories about his childhood and anti-Semitism and his brothers. It was a sort of large family, four brothers and 2 sisters. At an early age, he had this artistic inclination. He would sit down and look off into the distance and see buildings and industry. And at the same time, he would dig into the earth and in a way and do constructions with mud as an antidote almost to the onset of 20th century technology. At the age of 16, he got a scholarship from the Kodak Institute in Rochester, and he went to Paris. And he spent his youth, he spent 4 years in Paris from 1930 to 1934. And then he traveled to Palestine, then Palestine, and worked on a kibbutz, dug ditches in Jerusalem. And although my grandfather, and I'm speaking about my father's side, my mother's side is a little bit less clear to me, but I would say in terms of my own background, my father's influences more closely felt. His grandfather was a Hebrew school teacher, a Torah scholar, but of a secular sort. And the one strain in the family was Zionism, the one very strong singular strain. So I have an uncle, Ben Zion Emanuel. My father's full name is Theodore Herzl Emanuel. There was Aunt Rachel, Aunt Frida, Uncle Nathan. So there's an extremely strong strain of Jewish cultural identity, but there was not a strong religious strain. And that sort of plays into the artistic side of my family. Their vision was guided by poetry and art and fine art. My father, I suppose, until his death, dealt with sort of the most important, or what he considered the most important human phenomenon of the 20th century, which was man's inhumanity to man and the Holocaust. And part of his sort of failed battle with success was his immersion into difficult subject matters. His sculpture had a lot of pathos, and it was directly related to the nuclear family and the death of a hero. His relatives, for the most part in Europe, didn't survive the Holocaust. At the age of 6, we moved to Rome. That's 1962. So myself and my brothers, actually my younger brother was born in Rome. So it was my brother and my older sister, my mother and father moved to Rome. And I grew up there between 1962 and 1969. Italian was my second language. I consider myself fluent in Italian, and the draw of Rome became important to me later on in my jewelry career, where I returned there and renewed ties with Rome, renewed friendships, met new people, and created a sturdy commerce within Italy. So in 1969, my parents separated, and my mother brought us, the children, back to the United States. I went through a standard education. I ultimately went to Tufts University. I graduated with a major in psychology and a minor in biology. My tendency was scientific, but I always had this pull I always had this pull from the artistic side. I was also painting in college. And when I graduated, I was faced with the question of what to do. And I got a job in New York City with a second cousin who was a diamond dealer. And at that point, we all.
What year is this? This is 1969? What year is this?
Well, this is rushing ahead to, I would say, I graduated from college in 1968. In 1969, I was only 14 years old.
Okay, so you're not working at diamond dealer yet.
I went through my high school education and college education sort of rapidly. As a matter of fact, I skipped it. And I was faced with a sort of a fork in the road. And it was clear that, like my first job, they were paying me $50,000 a year, which was a fortune for a young man, 22 years old, fresh out of college. And I suppose that my inclination, my spiritual inclination, was to become an artist, to paint, to fulfill sort of an artistic destiny, much like the other artists in my family. My uncle was a painter, father a sculptor. I had another uncle who was a poet. I have a cousin who's a poet, etc. A sister who's an artist. And I suppose I went with commerce. I chose the less courageous path. And I suppose it was a socioeconomic decision. We grew up living sort of hand to mouth. There was, we weren't poor, but there was always that sort of desperate feeling of where is the next dollar coming from. And I did a 8-year stint with a company called Empire Diamond, which was on the 66th floor of the Empire State Building. And that was my initiation into the trade. I became a buyer. And I suppose that as a young man, being initiated into the secondhand jewelry business, that was the most ideal place for me, because I literally saw everything under the sun. People would bring their items for sale. And at one point, I would be seeing 50 people a day and working out of 3 offices with saloon doors. So people would mistake me for triplets. It almost felt like a Marx Brothers routine at the height of my activity there.
So I'm curious, so you're buying jewelry for those 6 years. How do you know how to value it, how to buy it? Was it a negotiation, or I'm just curious how you figured out that process?
Well, back then there were strict parameters that I had to apply to evaluation. How many carats, how much gold, what was the value of the color, if there was any. And I suppose that I had a pretty quick and steep learning curve. I started out actually sweeping the floors and weighing things, with one of these old scales with, penny weights, at one of these traditional balances, gold on the one hand and the counterweights on the other. But I think that transactionally, I was pretty good. I had empathy and patience with everyone that walked in. I suppose that I projected confidence in what I was doing. And I was more or less secluded from the aftermath of what happened to these pieces. Every once in a while, I'd go to the back office and see dealers, buying them, and sort of got an idea of what the open market bore for these things. But I guess in my youth, I had a pretty good compendium, a database within me. And as I sort of grew more and more familiar with the entire vocabulary of jewelry from A to Z, even watches, I had this sort of instant access to values that were formulated over a number of years, and those parameters still exist a little bit in a ghost form in how I figure goods nowadays, because I still dabble in the secondary market. I married, I had my first son, and I decided in 1986 that I no longer wanted to be employed by anyone. And so it was my will and my determination to resign from the place that I had worked for 7 years and to start on my own. I embarked upon this singular venture with very little trepidation. I was filled with what I thought was an incredible database of knowledge. And so I got a little booth on 47th Street. And in the next 2 years, I got my butt kicked, but very soundly. At the end of 2 years, I literally crawled on my force to my mother and begged her for a $35,000 loan to get me out of debt. What I discovered is that my education, my knowledge was an ivory tower type of knowledge. The skill set that I had developed up on the 66th floor of the Empire State Building was just fine for the 66th floor, but it didn't wash on 47th Street. And I took some hard knocks. I think that, encountering the real world of trading, buying and selling, and establishing a whole new set of values and negotiating skills was sort of a shock to me. I had lived in a genteel world of abstract values, and this was the real world. But eventually I got it right. I repaid my mother, and I sort of embarked on a successful trajectory. I became well known in the secondary market. I was sort of a rainmaker. I was at the center of a hub of activity in a very busy exchange, 10 West 47.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Can you just explain secondary market? I assume there's like brand new cars and used cars. Secondary market means someone's already worn the ring or
Exactly.
the jewelry.
Exactly. Okay. Although it's not strictly secondary market. I, at a certain point, being the son of a sculptor, I had this sort of innate ability to buy diamonds and to recut them. So at the same time that I was trading estate jewelry, secondhand jewelry, I was also taking stones out, looking at them, seeing how I could improve them. Now, a machine will tell you how to do it. There are very sophisticated machines that scan the stone, look at, with laser techniques, they locate the imperfections and give you 3 or 4 different options on how to recut a stone.
Really? It's fascinating.
Yeah, back then it was all visual, it was all manual, it was all gut. So one of the talents that I accrued along the way was cutting. And I could say that there's no such thing as a stone that I ever bought that I didn't recut. There was no point in me buying it unless I could modify it. And that was one of the things that was part of my arsenal as a secondhand dealer, how to gain even more value out of the goods. In my experience on 47th Street, I not only accumulated a trading experience, I went through a whole number of different partners because you buddy up with people. It's a solitary business at its worst. You're on your own with your 6-shooters, your checkbook, and you're traveling around the world, buying things in auctions and competing against others. But at its best, it's congenial. You find people that are part of your trading circle, and you buddy up and you buy things together.
Is it true that the deals are done still on handshakes there, or when you were there, was that the way it was done?
Yeah, I didn't meet a lawyer until my recent career, which is a different take.
Which we're gonna get to.
We'll get to that. I never met a lawyer before that. It's funny. The one thing leads to another in the business. Either you're on a upward trajectory and you're getting better and better at it and you're accumulating wealth, or you're languishing. And I was lucky enough to meet a really good partner ultimately. His name is Robert Sidian. He's still my partner. And I met him around 15 years ago. And we have completely different skill sets. He's more of a negotiator, businessman, money guy. I'm a little bit more on the creative side.
Okay.
With a skill set for analysis and understanding the goods and understanding, different gemstones. He can hold his own in that, but we're very different. But essentially, when I met Robert, I had done hundreds of millions of dollars of business with very little to show for it. I wasn't good at bookkeeping. Contras, were killing me. I didn't know who owed what. And when we met, he said, "Mark, listen, you're one of the most gifted people that I know, but you don't have a, excuse the language, pot to piss in." And I said, "That's true." And he says, "Well, let me show you how to hold on to money." And so one thing led to another. And this is where there's sort of a funny intersection between myself and Louis Pearlman. The bankruptcy of Fred Leighton was sort of a cataclysmic event in the trade. A mythical figure, Ralph Ismarian, had met some legal and credit issues with his creditors, and he was the then owner of Fred Leighton. And Fred Leighton went into liquidation, went into bankruptcy. So Robert, myself, Seema Gadamian, and Paul Lebetsky from Windsor, and Fred Leighton himself, Murray Monshine, AKA Murray Monshine, or Murray Monshine, AKA Fred Leighton. We all buddied up to buy Fred Leighton with Merrill Lynch as the main creditor. It turns out this was exactly in 2009, and it was fortuitous. It was fortuitous that it happened then, because essentially the world had stopped. The financial world had ground.
So right after Lehman collapse in 08.
It had ground to a halt, and bankruptcies were rampant all over the place, and even good businesses that had good cash flows, even good businesses, sort of ground to a halt and struggled with this period of crisis. And we ended up buying it successfully. And ironically, Louis Pearlman was part of the competitive bidding group. So unbeknownst to me, we were sort of like two ships in the night. We sort of laugh at it today, but that was our first meeting, which was a non-meeting, and that was 12 years ago. He had a pretty decent group to apply itself to an extremely competitive situation with various bids, but unfortunately he met up against the A-team. We were sort of formidable bidders, and it ended up being a purchase of 11,000 pieces of incredible estate jewelry, and we ended up liquidating it in a year, and it was extremely profitable. It was a purchase of $26 million, and all of us walked away with plenty of profits. And Robert and I were sort of looking at each other at the end of this liquidation period, and we're saying, well, what do we do now? And David Webb all of a sudden appeared on the horizon. So to give it some context, you know, for two kids who grew up in 47th Street, who bought everything under the sun, from scrap gold to like the finest pieces of jewelry, to from little melly insignificant stones to like amazing gemstones. David Webb was part of that great pantheon of amazing jewelers that made their mark in the 20th century. It was a name that one could mention alongside of Cartier and Van Cleef and Boucheron and Tiffany. It was sort of an amazing American counterpoint, you know, to European jewelry. And not knowing much about David Webb and the bankruptcy, we just resolved to buy it at whatever cost. It became like one of these gut emotional purchases. Here's two kids who started out with nothing, all of a sudden faced with this allure, this amazing ability to buy a historic company. And
so the David Webb story, he died at 50 tragically. That was what, about 10 years before you bought it, or 5 years before?
so David Webb died in 1975.
75, okay.
So at that point, his partner, Nina Silverstein, and her children, Sharon and Stanley, ran the company for 35 years as best as they could after he died. But the genius had packed his bags. He was gone. And they were basically left with a workshop, a number of jewelers, and the designs. And when we bought, we eventually became the winning bidders, because David Webb was bought out of bankruptcy. When we bought it, Nina was 90 years old. So
Wow.
God bless her. She had basically, for 35 years, done her best to engender the success of David Webb even after his absence. And she wasn't a natural jeweler. She was his bookkeeper. She was sort of the guardian of many things in the company. She was his right-hand man, so to speak, but she was not a natural jeweler. So here she was, sort of left with his sudden death and this historic legacy. And one could say that she did the best that she could with David Webb until she couldn't anymore. You know, the debts became crushing, and she was, you know, she faced bankruptcy, and that's where we stepped in. You could say that we were probably even less equipped than Nina to buy David Webb. Here's a couple of jewelers that basically walked around with 6-shooters and checkbooks, buying and selling jewelry, reducing all this beautiful stuff to a commodity, a simple commodity, buy, sell. My appreciation of jewelry was, I wouldn't say it was indifferent, but it was not emotional at all. It was about commodifying it. Even the most beautiful piece of jewelry, I was willing to buy it and flip it without considering, you know, the emotional effects of owning something beautiful. We literally had no experience owning a brand and running a corporation. And we've owned it for 11 years. And I would say that the experience of owning a brand is completely different than being a trader. It's a completely different skill set and a mindset. And my appreciation for jewelry as sort of a decorative art, as a high art, evolved slowly but surely to the point today where I'm very passionate about the subject matter, and all my thoughts are imbued with history and legacy and nuance because I'm not only passionate about it, I make it. I'm in a workshop with 25 master jewelers, extending the history of David Webb.
So were those master jewelers all there when you bought it, or you hired them? Because when I went to see your office, it was very impressive, but I didn't know, were they there the whole time, or did you handpick all of them?
Well, consider this. I mean, when you buy a company out of bankruptcy, you're buying sort of a skeletal product. Most of the great jewelry had been, as the company spiraled into bankruptcy, they sold off a lot of pieces at big discounts to satisfy the bank. They'd laid off a number of jewelers, of course. They had constricted the working hours and the days of some of these jewelers. So when we bought it, there was just a handful of jewelers. And one of the first things that we considered urgent was to hire back a number of jewelers, locate them, and hire them back. And fortunately, there was a core of jewelers that remained that had been there for many, many years. Even the setters, some of the setters had been there for 30 years. And the setting techniques at David Webb are very distinctive. There's a certain way that we set, if we're looking at something forensically, about whether it was made by us or not. And often we're called upon to authenticate pieces. Now, I'll hand it to one of the setters who's been around for 35 years, and I'll say, hey, did we set this piece? And they'll look at it. Yeah, this is our beadwork. Hugo probably set it in 1978. Yeah, this looks right, So we had one jeweler, a polisher, who recently retired during COVID, Benjamin Ray, amazing guy. He was an amazing black man from South Carolina, who in the early 60s had migrated north with his brother to find his fortune. And he was graced by his encounter with David Webb, who was an incredible individual who took him in and taught him the trade. And he had been with us for 54 years until he resigned during COVID because of health reasons. We have one jeweler who's been with us since 1972. So there's a core of knowledge that I was grateful to inherit. When you're building a workshop back, you need the older guys. And today we're always looking to hire new jewelers because there's always turnover, and but to keep that core of old knowledge, that's essential.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but since you bought David Webb, you've been really on the creative side, meaning you mentioned earlier you were more trading pieces. Now you said you were more in the second
market. Yeah.
But now you're not in the second market. Now you're in the first market. Is that correct, or am I wrong in that assumption?
So there's a number of silos in running a brand. There's the business side. There's the brand side. How to project the brand properly. There's PR. There's administration. There's wholesale. Because David Webb distributes to various independent jewelers, and it has a relationship with Neiman Marcus, Bergdorf, Saks, etc. So there's a wholesale component to David Webb, and there's a retail component. And we have two flagships. One is in Beverly Hills, and one is on 74th Street in Madison, where you visited. The workshop which you saw is our engine room. Without an engine room, a ship can't sail. So the production of David Webb jewelry and the creative aspect of it is basically what I'm in charge of. You know, if I had I don't have a desk at David Webb. I don't have an office. I basically go from station to station, making sure that everyone's okay, that everything is working well. But if I had to talk about my main emphasis, you could say that I'm very much involved in the creative end of it. When we first bought David Webb, we inherited something that was pretty much in shambles. The archives were just scattered on the floor. We literally had to reassemble them. I put them all, I put around 100,000, or no, I put around 50,000 drawings in boxes and brought them up to the attic of the building where David Webb was. And for 3 months, I pretty much shut myself up in the attic to understand what we had bought. Because we had bought a couple hundred pieces along with the company, but those pieces weren't much to speak of. I had knowledge, a certain amount of knowledge of David Webb jewelry, having bought it over the years in auctions, and I sort of had a working vocabulary in place of what I was dealing with. I had a sense of the essence of the brand. But I was keen on understanding it in a more profound way. So I literally locked myself up in that attic for 3 months. Probably lost a couple of friends. I was sort of like a monk in isolation. But people knew where to find me. And I set about sort of studying the entire range of this iconic brand. And what I saw, I mean, later on, I think that we're going to go through some pictures, some photography of some of the jewelry. But what I wanted to understand was the evolution of the artist, of David Webb, the young man, to his last years. David Webb, the artist, the mature artist, and how he got there. And what unfolded was this beautiful picture, this beautiful evolution of the artist as a young man to that sort of mature statement that he created. Along the way, he trailblazed American jewelry. He became the quintessential jeweler. And what we inherited was this American legacy, a great American archive, mid-century archive, and the requirement to burnish the brand faithfully. That is, to have a notion of history and what David Webb jewelry was, and to honor that history while also making it new, making it more relevant.
So when you bought Fred Leighton, within a year you liquidated things, you made a lot of money. This sounds completely different. Here you're buying a business and you're assessing what you have and you're really just building the brand, right? I mean, it's totally different than Fred Leighton. Is that correct in my assessment?
Fred Leighton, we were doing something familiar. We were buying something, gutting it, taking it apart, looking at individual values, selling off the jewelry. We eventually sold the name to the Kwiat Group, and they essentially, as part of the deal, took over a quarter of the inventory. We had no interest in owning Fred Leighton. We sort of had our eyes set on David Webb. For what reason, I don't know. It turns out that our decision was okay, but at that point it was folly, because we had zero experience in hand to take on to take on this new business. At certain points, me and my partner looked at each other and said, "Oh my God, what did we do?" You know. But it's funny, you know. Coming from my background and him from his background, we never shirked from work. And I've always worked hard in my lifetime, and I've never taken anything for granted. As much as I'm successful, there's still that pit, that hunger that I recognize in my parents, who sort of went through the Great Depression. But David Webb, you're right, is a completely different. It's a completely different approach to jewelry. It's not deconstructive. It's not the secondhand business. It is completely constructive. It's about making beautiful jewelry, extending the legacy of the brand. It's a whole other skill set. And, you know, now I feel comfortable about talking about David Webb, and I feel comfortable about all of the nuances of the business. But 10 years ago, it would have been an alien experience for me, as it was when we were sort of confronted with this gross fact that we had bought this historic, two kids from 47th Street had bought this, you know, great American brand.
So Mark, you know, the hour I told you would go by quick, and but do you want to get Rachel to bring in the pictures so we can talk about
Sure.
some of the creative? Rachel?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yes,
Rachel,
yes. Let me get.
start putting some of that up,
Uh-huh.
and then I want to bring Lewis in. Let's try to get there.
Mhm.
So that's a Mark. It's fascinating. You really went through the whole process very clearly. So I really appreciate that. It was very, very helpful.
Well, it's not over. You know,
And I didn't say it's over.
it's you know, going to work every day is an adventure, as it should be. There was a survey. I once was reading something from an Indian wise man, and he said, "Your day is not complete until you visit the 4 houses every day." And he says, you know, one of the houses is the house of cognition, of, you know, mental acuity, the house of reason. And oh, okay. The other house, sorry, the other house is the emotional house, the house of love. And the third house is the house of material things, of concrete, of making things, the world that we inhabit. And the final house is the spiritual world. And so when you can complete a day having visited those 4 houses, your day is complete.
I like that. I never heard that. Thank you for sharing that. So tell us what we're looking at. That is David Webb, right?
So that's David Webb, the young rock star in the jewelry business.
From North Carolina, if I recall, right?
He started out his business in 1948. He was 6'5" and a lovely Southern gentleman, a confirmed bachelor who came to the exciting shores of Manhattan as a young man at the age of 17. And he started out in a tiny little office on 47th Street. And through his talent and perseverance, you know, ended up being one of the most influential jewelers of the 20th century. I imagine he was a man that could have done anything, a surgeon, a musician, but he chose jewelry because of his background. You know, he came from Asheville, North Carolina. He worked in his uncle's jewelry store. He had a facility for jewelry and design from a very early age. And when he hit Manhattan, his incredible potential and talent took off. This is a picture of him. It's sort of unusual to see pictures of jewelers in the 1950s because insurance companies prohibited that type of PR. To them, it was considered too risky to show the face of jewelers. As a matter of fact, there's only one picture that I know of Harry Winston, a very famous one, sitting at his desk. And this is one of the very few extant pictures of David Webb. I imagine he's around 30 years old in this picture. From the jewelry, it looks like it's 1955. He's got some mega necklaces, some fun things on his desk. And I suppose he's contemplating his creations. He's contemplating the next steps. He's successful already. His pieces have been on the cover of Vogue. He goes to all the major parties in New York City. And there are frequent sightings of him at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where as a self-taught person, he's learning about the vocabulary of jewelry, the history of jewelry.
Sorry, go to the next one. So tell us this piece, please.
So this piece was first made in 1963. This is a true David Webb icon. It sort of entrains all of the great techniques of David Webb. It's a Cellini-esque type of piece with a verve for enamel work, design, platinum and diamond work, color. It's sort of the centerpiece of one of our categories, which is animalia, or we call it the kingdom. And it's one of the true great icons. It was worn by literate people. It was worn by Diana Vreeland, who was the editor of Vogue. She wore it in I imagine, a double-fisted way. She had two of them, and she wore matching zebra earrings. It's something that we still make. It was made in 1963. So this, by David Webb's definition, is a mass-produced piece. We've made around 75 of them since 1963, which means, let's do a quick calculation. We've done almost 1.5 of them a year, which is.
Does it take that long to do one?
If you look at the inside of the piece, it's all, it's very carefully assembled. You have those screws that you can see in that return on the inside. We have 1 or 2 jewelers that are conscripted to do it.
Fascinating.
It's a complex piece, but it wears so beautifully and so classy.
Okay. So Rachel's going to go to the next one.
And in 1963, that's when, 1962 and 1963, that's when Elizabeth Taylor, Jackie Kennedy, the celebrities, the jet setters discovered him. And the zebra was one of the sort of great pieces of that era.
So tell us the next one. Are those the rings we're looking at? It's not the boot.
We're going to ahead 5 years, and I'd like you to look at the boot. And you can probably tell from the boot that those boots were made for walking.
Okay.
That's groovy, that's psychedelic. We're looking at the late 1960s. And if you look at the evolution of David Webb jewelry, what's important to understand is that David Webb, the artist, sort of understood that there was change in the air, that there was a cultural revolution going on. There was the birth of feminism. There was anti-war demonstrations, and jewelry and women were in the workplace, and they had rights. And jewelry became more demonstrative and in your face and colorful, and things that could be worn in the office by the women during the daytime, and that could easily transition to nightwear, to the social clubs, the bars, etc., the dinner events. So David Webb, the artist, made a conscious effort, or made a conscious decision to coincide his design work with what was happening in culture. And that's one of the qualities of a good artist, to have that extra antenna to see what people want, what's going on. It's almost instinctive. We can go to the next photograph.
Okay.
This is a pair of really strong rock crystal bracelets. Let's get back to...
Yeah, right there. Okay, perfect.
And, you know, rock crystal is it's a material that we use a lot in our jewelry. It's all hand carved. It mostly comes from Brazil. It's quartz. And the combination of rock crystal and gold is a stunning combination. On the left, you have something that has sort of garlands running up the middle. So it's an ode. It's a strong bracelet, but it's a little bit more delicate than that tank bracelet on the right. And one has sort of a residual floral sensations in it, that garlandy, that organic quality. The other one is a little bit tougher. And these are strong statement pieces designed for the 1970s woman. They are declarative. They speak to the strength of the jewelry. They also speak to the spirit of the women that wore them. We still make them because they resonate still very strongly with our audience, with our clientele. They wear beautifully. They have that glow at night. And they have this essential David Webb character that any good David Webb piece has. It's recognizable from across the room.
Beautiful. Okay, next, Rachel.
I mentioned that David Webb was frequently cited at the Metropolitan Museum. And this is his distinctive design, but it's a take on all kinds of cultural sources. It's at once Mayan, it's at once Chinese, it's Greco-Roman, it has those shield shapes. And it speaks to the power of women. It has, you know, these pieces are potent, they're talismanic, they're heraldic. And a woman who wears them feels their power. The gold has that power of sunlight, doesn't it? It it has a transformative effect. But really, from an artistic point of view, it is synthetic. It's a synthesis of all kinds of styles. And David Webb, the jewelry at its best, is a form of visual jazz. This is one of these examples of a piece that hybridizes all of these art forms and is a beautiful piece of visual jazz, but it really stands on its own. It's got a lot of strength. Very
Okay.
David.
Beautiful. Rachel? Next one.
This piece is a jade, ruby, and gold necklace. Again, it's a prime example of the artistic and cultural influences that David Webb, the artist, absorbed in the 1970s. It was made, I think, around 1972. And it's one of these declarative pieces of design that incorporates the ancient world, and yet is given a sort of a modernist interpretive thrust with typical decorative skills and artistic skills applied by the master. There's white, there's red, there's the white jade plaque in the middle, there's the green jade on top, and it's all unified by gold, scroll work, and rubies. Once again, a prime example of the visual jazz that David Webb is.
Okay, next piece, Rachel.
So these rings, this tumble of rings that you see it's an iterative flow of Art Deco-ish design. These rings have volume. They have a modernist presence. We actually call this design fugue Manhattan minimalism, because when minimalism was being born in New York or in America in the late 50s and the early 60s, the Frank Stellas, the Kenneth Nolans, the Agnes Martins, there was a austere metropolitan sophistication to this minimalism. And although these aren't exactly minimalist designs, they have that influence of the art scene. They have a little pop art in them. They have a little bit of Manhattan minimalism in them, but they're born out of the Art Deco period, that black enamel, the linear qualities of it, the sense of cubism in them, the metropolitan New York quality to them. It's something that we do quite a bit of, and it's a strong design fugue that is part of our core jewelry. The use of enamel, the use of pave diamonds, the volumes, the use of diamond pave to decorate, the intricate decoration of strong surfaces.
Okay. Rachel?
This is a little bit of everything, isn't it? It's these cuffs are heraldic, they're strong. This is the Bastille series. They have a Renaissance quality to them. These old bronze doors with with armor on them. There's also a Art Deco quality to them, and there's a great deal of modernism and geometry to them. And of course, there's the introduction of color, which David Webb exercises with a plenty. The use of turquoise, carved stones. It's all part of our art form. These pieces imbue the wearer with strength, with confidence. As a matter of fact, you have to have a little confidence to wear them to begin with. There's a spiritual match for every piece of jewelry. These jewels were not designed by some designer who put his head on a pillow and dreamed of spinning shapes in a vacuum. These were designed for real women, personages at the time, who insisted on something that matched their personalities.
Okay, Rachel, thank you.
A flaunting of our colors, a scandalous array of David Webb rings, and what we do with design and what we do with central stones. Our mountings are imaginative, strong, decorative. They embrace the center stones, and they embrace color. We don't shy away from large stones. Sometimes large is the only way to go when you want a certain type of expression, and sometimes small is the way to go. But certainly there's a piece of color for everyone. And what you're seeing is part of our art form, the mounting of center stones.
Beautiful. Okay, next one.
David Webb died in 1975. And in 1974, when he started to get sick, what you're looking at is part of his last design fugue. He designed around 20 to 30 totemic forms in jewelry. And if you look at his early work and where he came from, in the 1950s, a lot of it was floral. He was going mano a mano with Van Cleef and the other houses, and basically working under a European influence. Here in 1974, he's all on his own. He's in a place where no one else has gone. You're seeing here the mature artist giving us a hint of where he was going with his modernism, with his design verve, with his facility, with synthesizing forms and color, with his inventiveness. And you have a hint of where he was going. And after this picture, where he was going, we can only imagine. It's a mystery. This is sort of the conclusion of the chapter of his life as a designer. This is his last design fugue. He died of pancreatic cancer and he went rather rapidly. But to me, this is it's an important picture because it gives us a hint of where he was going. And as someone who bought the company, it gives me a challenge, and it's a guide for things to come. And one of the things that I did as a creative director is I extended the language of totem. I iterated on it. I took a lot of these forms, introduced color, did other things to it.
Wow.
It was one of the really exciting challenges that I took on.
I think I have one more that we chose to discuss tonight.
Oh, this is a picture of our new ad campaign. It's part of our new collection. Coming out of the despair of the pandemic and the isolation of it, and sort of the darkness and the political discontent and the negativity and the fear, I embarked upon a design fugue. I wanted to call it the Summer of Love, to harken back to a time when there was more happiness, there was more freedom, there was more cultural expression. And this necklace that that I designed along with Megumi, my artist who works with me, who does graphic design. We came up with this concept of using floral components with the strength of chain. Chain being one of the formal and strong parts of David Webb jewelry. We do chains ad nauseum. Chains are the visible recognition or reckoning with strength, right? With the strength of the wearer. And flowers are an ode to the delicacy of the past, and very much part of the formal design work that we do. These are abstract flowers. They're clusters of color. There's turquoise, there's chalcedony, there's sapphire, and some of the chain is enameled. So it's again, a synthetic, combinatory piece of jazz, using color, floral components, and then the strength, the unifying strength of chain. So making this collection was a lot of fun. It was a challenge. In a way, everyone in the company was involved. So it was an exercise of teamwork.
So this was during COVID, the team put this together.
Oh, yeah, this is something that I dreamed up of during COVID, yeah.
Okay, so I feel like we could go on all night, and we have to invite you back to the synagogue. Hopefully COVID will go away soon, but I didn't even get to many of the discussions we wanted to get to this evening, but because Louis was a little late coming on, and Louis was supposed to introduce Mark. Louis, I wanted you to maybe help close or talk about Mark and any questions you wanted to discuss this evening with Mark. And I want to thank you, Louis, most importantly, for making tonight happen.
Also, a big shout out to Julie, who was really responsible for getting us all together. Julie is Louis's better half,
Yes,
for sure.
We know that. Louis, are you on mute or you're good? Louis, you're on mute. Louis, you're on mute. You need to take it off mute. May take him a second. You need to, okay. Technology is fascinating. But Mark, one thing is amazing is your passion. I come from the private equity world, but you bought David Webb, and you're really trying to preserve his legacy, and you're very passionate about who he was. And you speak of him as if he's almost a family member, and I'm saying that in a very positive way. You respect of him, and I think it's very unique. I've never seen that, someone who buys a brand and really is so passionate about it.
Well, I resided in the house of his spirit.
Okay.
For quite a long time. So, and I still reside in that house every day, the spirit of David Webb. And in a way, I'm in a privileged position because I'm like a conductor that has been handed down all of this beautiful sheet music. And the two questions that I have to answer are pretty basic, which is what to play, what sheet music to play, and really how to play it. The third question, the why, is a little bit more complex, and it has to do with market conditions, the economy, etc. It's also a spiritual question, why make something? But it's all really interesting. Yeah.
Louis, are we good? No, Louis, I can't hear you yet.
I think Rachel's correcting it. Louis has to be given the option to be able to speak. He doesn't have the option right now.
I'm not so sure that's correct, but okay. I think it has to do with his own computer, but they look like they're working on it. Rabbi, did you want to add something before Louis gets on?
Mark, I just had one quick question. That's something that came up a few times in the beginning of your presentation, both in relation to your father and in relation to yourself. You said that a lot of the drive has a spiritual component to it. Your drive for creativity. I thought that was an interesting idea. It's not necessarily just for, to be successful in the business. It's not necessarily just to feel that you're building something. You actually find some type of deeper meaning in your work. So perhaps want to know if you could elaborate on that.
Well, in a way, I had this reckoning with creativity because you could say that what I do right now at David Webb is a sublimation of my artistic roots, of my artistic nature. And you can suppress things for a long time. In a way, I inhabited a different life as a trader. Gunslinging in the secondary market was easy for me, but it wasn't in my heart. And when I was conscripted to revitalize David Webb, the brand, and to bring it back and to look at it, the entire oeuvre in a creative way and to make creative choices, you could say that I came home spiritually. That is, it was more in my nature as an artist, as a creator. I still feel a certain betrayal of my artistic roots. In a way, I still imagine myself as a painter or as an artist. And yet here I am. I am the life that I have lived. There is no other. I am what I do. And yet there is a grace to what I'm doing currently. And there's a logic to the sum of what I'm doing, and it's faithful and sublimating of some of my artistic core.
Interesting. Thank you.
Hello, can you hear
Hey,
me?
Louis, we get to see you now. We get to hear you. Thank you so much for everything tonight, Louis.
Well, look, it's better late than never, they tell me. Yeah, I just wanted to quickly, and I'm sorry I'm at the tail end and not at the beginning. I just wanted to quickly add that having Mark on here tonight reminded me that being an artist and being creative, which he certainly is demonstrated in many different ways. And I can tell you that not only is he a master jeweler, he's also an amazing cook. So I just wanted to add that to the list. I think we can even make him the resident Italian kosher cook for Fifth Avenue Synagogue. He would be amazing. But leaving that aside, yeah, we met when we were on the opposite ends of a bidding process for Fred Layton. But over the years, we've become good friends, and I must say that my wife has been very much involved with his jewelry. I don't know if that's a good thing or not. It may be a good thing for her. I'm not so sure it's a good thing for me, but that's another issue. I'm glad we were able to hear Mark. It's a bit of a different type of evening talking about jewelry. I think there are very few people we've had on the program who are in this industry. But I think, Jacob, you're the one that inspired me to come up with something new. and I think Mark fit the bill. I think he certainly gave us something else to think about tonight. Anyway, the easiest way to talk about Mark and to talk about David Webb is to simply walk into their store on Madison Avenue. You'll really get an understanding of what he does.
But
So thank you very much.
Thank you, Louis.
yeah, Louis, you brought us Harry Macklow and Mark Emanuel, and they're both very creative, accomplished people. And I'm ready for the next one, Louis. So we'll talk tomorrow.
Okay.
But
I'll try and make it unusual.
Okay, you definitely made it unusual. And Mark, I'm serious about, we're renovating the synagogue so we can look as nice as Lewis's building next door. And when it's renovated, we expect to have you come visit us in the synagogue. And I feel like we just opened up tonight, but there's a lot more to learn from you and your passion and creativity. And I wanted to talk about the industry, but because the hour is late, I want to talk how the industry's changed over the last 50 years, but why don't we save that to a phase 2 discussion at a later time? That's okay. But, I felt like I learned a lot, and I got to really feel for David Webb, and there's been a lot of comments on the chat. I think you inspired people about jewelry. Jewelry today is a little bit like art. People are buying things and holding it. I think that your career change is a little bit what the world changed. I think people see jewelry today a lot differently than they did 50 or 100 years ago. So it sounds like you're leading that in the industry, and hope you continue your great work, and really grateful for your passion and your friendship and your time this evening.
Thank you, Jacob. Thank you, Louis, for the introduction to the Fifth Avenue umbrella. It was a privilege to be able to talk, and yes, indeed, there is a lot about commerce in the industry and its trajectory that we never touched upon. So it's exciting to leave things open for the future. And certainly if you have a kitchen in the Fifth Avenue synagogue, I'm definitely up for a kosher Italian meal.
Done. That's done. That's done. And we talked a little bit, Louis, and we spoke a little bit, Mark, but our synagogue over the last 60 years had a lot of pioneers in the industry. I don't want to throw around names tonight, but it was a synagogue that really was connected to what you do, Mark. And we talked about that in our meeting at your offices. But I think we'll do that in the next session, and I look forward to it. And I'm excited about the cooking. I love Italian food. We lost Treveri; they left Manhattan, so now we have you, Mark.
Okay.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening. Good night. Good night. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.